If you're looking for a Swiss Army knife of a camera between the cost of $1,000 to $1,200, look no further than the Canon 80D or the Sony A6300. Both feature 24 megapixel APS-C sized sensors that are improved. On the Sony side, it's a copper wiring that makes the sensor more efficient in capturing light. On the Canon side, it's a dual pixel autofocusing feature that allows for better tracking during video. Sports focusers will be interested in the 425 phase detection points for the Sony and the 45 cross type focusing points on the Canon. Both have built-in flash, built-in Wi-Fi, built-in NFC, built-in microphone jacks, and both have very impressive focusing for live view. However, there are many important differences about both of these cameras. Let's start with the Canon. Obviously, the articulating touchscreen monitor is a huge difference. This interface makes it super quick and easy to change your camera settings, to review images, to navigate your menus. Beautiful, awesome feature on any camera, in my opinion. The Canon also has a headphone jack, and this is very important for videographers to hear the audio signal coming into the camera. It also has a top LCD monitor which displays certain camera settings, and it has a bunch of great other features including anti-flicker, 3 to 10x digital zoom, and a longer lasting battery. When we look at the Alpha 6300, we have tons of great features specifically for videographers, including 4K video, S-Log2 and S-Log3, which allow videographers to capture a greater dynamic range of shades. We have gamut display. We have 120 frames per second at 1080, which is going to allow for twice the slow motion of what we see on the Canon, which is 60 frames per second. We also have peaking focus, which is great to dial in manual focusing. Surprisingly, the Alpha 6300 does not have a headphone jack, and the one that I bought with the kit lens didn't even have a battery charger. Its maximum shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second compared to 1/8000th of a second on the Canon. And the Sony uses an electronic viewfinder where the Canon has an optical viewfinder that allows you to see in real time through the lens. Now, there are tons of different ways I can test these cameras. I tend to want to stick to the core features, the shooting, the image quality, the ISO performance, the focusing, things of that nature, because I know that specifications on paper don't always match real-world shooting hands-on experience. And that is the heart of the matter with my Epic Shootouts. I'm not picking on one camera or another when I find something wrong with it. I'm trying to produce the world's best camera comparisons between two competing models. This is really aimed to help you to make an informed buying decision. I have no affiliation with Canon or Sony, so if I say I'm seeing something weird with the camera, it's really from a good place. It's to inform and allow you to have an expectation of what you would see if you were to shoot with the camera yourself. Almost everything that I'm sharing with you is going to be based on hands-on tests, methodologies, things you can see, numbers, data we can measure. And in the past, I've included the methodologies in the video, but for the sake of time, I'm going to put a link in the description to my blog, and I will list every methodology that I use to get this data if I don't present it here on the video. I also know these cameras really well, inside and out, because I have produced a crash course training video for both the Canon 80D as well as the Sony 6300. So whichever one you decide to get, if you struggle learning it, just know you are in very good hands, and I will teach you how to use your camera like a pro in no time. One of the first tests that I like to do is the sports focusing. And in the past, mirrorless cameras have had a problem when you rack zoom during a burst mode. And another thing is I wasn't really impressed with this kit lens. So what I decided to do was invest in the new 24-70 2.8 G Master. And the reason why I want to do this is because mirrorless cameras typically focus much better with native lenses. So in most of the tests you're going to be seeing from the 6300, this is the lens that was used. I'm actually very impressed with it. But yeah, during a burst mode, if you were racking this zoom ring while you're firing, in the past that's kind of messed up some of the scores. And so what I decided to do this time was to pre-test it. It looked good. And the three tests that I like to do is a side-to-side running subject, a subject moving towards the camera in good light, and a subject running away from the camera into heavy backlight. Now, another side note was the A6300 was burning through its buffers so quickly that most of the sports shooting tests were performed at 8 frames per second. For side-to-side shooting without racking the zoom ring during a burst, the Canon 80D scored a 92%, with the Sony A6300 scoring a perfect 100%. For a subject moving forward into good light while racking the zoom ring, the Canon 80D scored 74%, with the A6300 scoring an 84%. For a subject running away into hard backlight, the Canon scored 70%, with the Alpha 6300 scoring a 58%. I was suspicious that racking the zoom ring was the reason for the significant drop in accuracy in hard backlight on the Sony, so I repeated it without racking, and sure enough, the Sony scored a very high 96%. This is a little bit of a mixed result. If you're zooming in and out during a burst in good light, the A6300 has the win. Backlight seems to be the Achilles heel of the 6300 when racking the zoom ring. The Canon 80D is more of a consistently accurate camera. The majority of your shots will be in focus regardless of the conditions and whether or not you are zooming in or out. These are all important factors to keep in mind depending on what kind of shooting you are doing. So a camera's buffer performance is how many shots it can take before it starts to slow down. Alpha 6300 is 11 frames per second. We're going to try it on RAW first, and then we'll try it on JPEG. Let's take a listen to the Canon 80D. Nice. And stop. Very nice. So now we're going to try it on JPEG only. Ready, go. So maybe twice as many. Okay, so now we're going to try the 80D on JPEG Smooth just to see if we can get a difference in buffer performance. You ready? Set, go. Go ahead and stop when you get to there. Oh, here it comes. Starting to slow down. So you can hear that on JPEG, there is a huge difference in the buffer performance advantage going to the 80D. So in the past, I've gotten a lot of comments about the buffer test in that it may not be an even playing field because one camera might shoot at many faster frames per second and another camera might have greater file sizes. So how can we tell exactly what we're getting? There's actually a really easy way to calculate the buffer space in the maximum write speed, and I've done that for both cameras. On the Sony, we're looking at 458 megabytes of buffer space. On the Canon, it's about 420. The write speed for the Sony is about 280 megabits per second compared to 643 megabits per second on the Canon. So the Canon's writing speed is much faster, and even though it has a smaller buffer space, it's able to clear it quickly and get back into the shooting. If you were to fill up both cameras' buffers and wait for them to clear, you're looking at about 6 seconds on the 80D compared to 16 seconds on the A6300. So I typically like to pick an overall sports winner, and this was really tough simply because I'm a firm believer the Alpha 6300 is more accurate, more precise. Those are two different things. I'll talk about that in a second. But the Canon, the ability to change the focusing squares, it was faster. The buffer cleared faster. And so there are advantages to both cameras for shooting a sporting event. If it was a paid job and somebody told me you could only pick one camera, I would probably side with the Canon 80D simply because the downtime of changing the focusing squares and the buffering clearing would allow me to continue to stay on the action. That's really the only reason why I would choose it over the Sony. The Sony, if you have a good lens and you don't mind the long buffer wait for it to clear, It's amazing. I'm really impressed with it. And it's the first mirrorless camera that I've seen beat a DSLR in a head-to-head matchup. In my early testing of both cameras, I noticed the 80D would sometimes miss focus when a secondary object was close to the square I was using. In this case, I was focusing on this label of a printer, single square, at a wide aperture of f1.2, and if the paper tray was too close to the square, the 80D would miss focus. When I closed the paper tray, there were no issues. When I used the same lens with a Metabones adapter on the A6300, I didn't have this problem, with or without the paper tray being next to the focusing square. Now this brings up the topic of accuracy versus precision. In my own words, I define accuracy as the ability to generally hit a target. From the sports test, I believe both cameras are quite accurate on a moving subject. I like to think of precision as a high level of consistency in terms of where the focus is specifically landing. This is going to be more important for certain kinds of photographers, say macro photographers or anyone who shoots very wide. Now, it's almost impossible to consistently test precision on a moving subject, but we can measure the precision of a camera's focusing clusters by restricting a window through which the camera focuses. Long story short, I cut different sized squares through a poster board and suspended it about 7.5 feet away from a focusing target made up of 1 square centimeter boxes with 5 points of font thickness. The A6300 was able to focus through a 1.5 centimeter opening on all of its focusing clusters. This even included the zone modes in the far corners. It was very impressive. I set up my camera to record what I saw through the lens of the 80D in real time, which was unable to focus on the target through the same opening. This is regardless of the cluster or distance it was from that opening, even if the square appears to be aiming completely through it. It also failed at 3 centimeters and 5 centimeter square openings. However, when I added a higher contrast target, the 80D was able to get focus lock. This was a very interesting result because it suggests to me that the 80D is in fact capable of precise focus. It simply requires more contrast in its targets to do so, and therefore I think it's more accurate to say the A6300 is more sensitive in its precision than the 80D, and that was a result I wasn't exactly expecting to find. Both cameras have several live view focusing options that allow the camera to automatically focus, including direct aim, face detection, and object tracking in video. Both cameras did very well in all the tests that I performed. While the tracking could sometimes be tricked with busy or fast-moving subjects, they did very well on high contrast targets. In terms of functionality, this is too close to call. However, when we consider the ease of use with the 80D's touchscreen monitor, we have to give it the win for video tracking and focusing. It's just so fast and easy to set up that it gives the 80D a distinct advantage. However, one exception to this is the A6300's eye detection. This feature allows photographers to get a precise focus lock on the eye, where the 80D is limited to the entire face. With wider apertures, this is critical. Huge win for portrait photographers for the A6300. In my low light focusing test, my two targets at different distances were at 6.5 EV and -2 EV. At 50 millimeters, both cameras acquired 30 focus locks in 58 seconds, an even tie. At 24 millimeters, the A6300 scored 45 seconds and the 80D, again, 58 seconds. At 70 millimeters, the A6300 failed to achieve focus lock on the dark target, but the 80D scored 54 seconds. But let's keep in mind the A6300 also has an autofocus assist lamp, and when it's turned on, it scored 52 seconds at the same focal length. So it's a bit of a mixed result. Just know that both cameras focus very well in low light. Now there are lots of different ISO tests I ran. For raw stills, the grain performance is very comparable up to 6400, where we start to see an advantage for the Sony. At 12,800, it's about a half stop advantage. And at 25,600, it is significantly better in the Sony. When we look at the JPEG versions of the same charts, we see a softening and darkening of the shadows of the Canon at higher ISOs. However, they are a little more comparable. In terms of high ISO portraits, I think 6400 is about the limit for both of them. Canon starts to get a little soft, but it's otherwise usable. I see more detail in the Sony, but I also see some scattered artifacts. I would say that overall Sony has the advantage at higher ISOs for stills in both RAW and JPEGs, but it's going to be a lot harder to see until you start shooting over ISO 3200. For video, however, it is a completely different ballgame. Watch what happens to the midtones on the candle on the right as we increase our ISO. By 3200, there are already grain issues. By 6400, there is a clear difference. And even at 12,800, the Sony looks much better than the Canon in terms of grain, dynamic range, and it also appears the Canon's blacks are being over-crushed. In fact, the A6300 at 12,800 4K downsized looks better than the Canon at 3200. That's over 2 stops of advantage for video ISO grain. When we compare the color charts at high ISOs, I look for dancing pixels in different colors. At 3200, the Canon already starts running into trouble, and all the way up to 12,800, the Sony is really impressing. For high ISO noise during video recording, huge win for the Sony. I would say it's at least 2, maybe a little bit more stops of advantage. I have a great shirt that instantly tells me about a camera's Moire performance, which is a splotchy artifact that shows up in certain patterns. The 80D shows strong Moire at standard HD, and the A6300 shows it in all the resolutions and frame rates I tested. However, it was much worse at 30 frames standard HD. I'm not seeing a clear winner here, so I will let you be the judge. In our side-to-side rolling shutter test, the A6300 shows lots of the jello effect when panning left to right at 4K. The 80D much less so. I do think, however, both cameras perform better at 1080 60p. I like to measure each of the camera's temperatures after 20 minutes of video recording. The Canon stayed relatively cool between 97 and 98 degrees Fahrenheit shooting 1080, with the Sony running as high as 103 to 104 when shooting 4K. I have overheated it a couple times, so until Sony updates its firmware to prevent this, I would not recommend the A6300 for event videography or anything that requires very long takes. In terms of overall video quality, both cameras have decent image at 30 frames per second, with the A6300 being downsized from 4K to 1080 to show here. However, the A6300 really shines in 24p mode. There is something sharper and crisper about the image at 24p over 30p. So if you're going for the absolute best image quality, I would say A6300 4K 24p is the winner here. My dynamic range tests measure a camera's ability to differentiate between many shades of darkness. The full methodology is outlined on my blog, but suffice it to say, I'm looking for the point where the file cannot differentiate between 2 adjacent ND filters at 1/3 stop intervals. I also decided to include the 70D as a reference. While the 80D is at least showing 2/3 stops of improvement over the 70D, as well as less shadow noise, the A6300 is at least 2/3 stops better than the 80D in its shadows. As a side note, the Sony does have an issue with its compressed RAW files in an artifact referred to as posterization, which are these little compression blocks we see when really pushing shadows next to highlights. Canon's RAW files do not seem to have this issue, so while overall the A6300 wins for dynamic range, we would certainly want to see a firmware update that allows for uncompressed or at least lossless compressed Sony RAW files. Another important note is that when shooting on a continuous or a silent mode, Sony's images become 12-bit instead of 14. Not a huge deal most of the time, something to keep in mind. Speaking of silent shutter modes, how quiet are they really? Let's listen to each on their burst modes. First, the 80D. Next, the A6300. If you have a need for completely silent photography, the A6300 is the winner. Grab a pen and a piece of paper and list it from 1 to 12 and write down whether you think the image on the left, A, or the image on the right, B, is better. This is what I call the image quality test. There are no correct or incorrect answers. It'll just tell you which camera's color and white balance you prefer. If your score is close to even, then at least to your eye, the cameras are comparable. If you score very highly in favor of one over the other, that is a really good indicator that you prefer the look coming out of one camera more. Most of these images were taken with auto white balance, with the exception of the 2 flash shots which were taken on flash white balance of their respective cameras. I noticed that Canon's auto white balance and colors seemed to be more consistent, whereas the Sony was more fickle in different shooting situations. Sony users will have to be more mindful about changing their white balance correctly. Canon's monitor also seemed to be more accurate, where the Sony monitor seemed to lean just a touch orange. Once I opened the Sony images on my computer, however, they seemed to be much closer to reality. Alright, so you ready for the results? Here they are. Count up which camera you preferred based on the image quality, and that will give you a really good idea of which camera's color science, or how it determines colors, that you personally prefer. So in conclusion, which camera would I recommend to what type of photographer, and which camera am I declaring the overall winner, and which one am I going to keep? I think the Canon is an amazing camera. It's a very nice upgrade to the 70D, which came out about 3 years ago, which was an amazing camera in itself. The focusing systems in live view are definitely better. The dynamic range is definitely better. If you're coming from a Canon camera, maybe 3 or 4 years old, this is going to be a very nice upgrade. If you're a beginning photographer and you have the budget for it, this is your first camera, it's going to be very easy to learn. I think landscape photographers are going to appreciate the dynamic range. I think street photographers are going to love that low light focusing, center focusing square. Videographers, certain types of videographers, if you don't need 4K video, if you're okay with the Moire, this is a great all-round camera. It's very polished. It's a very mature product. I'm pretty impressed with it. I'm more impressed with it than I thought I would be. If you are looking for a compact solution, all-in-one, 4K video, more precise and accurate focusing, high frames per second, absolutely loaded with video tools, I think you're going to have to go with the Sony A6300. I think portrait photographers should also go with the Sony simply because of the eye detection focus. It's that good to shoot with wide aperture lenses. It makes it really, really easy. Sony has done a great job coming out with new lenses as fast as they have. We got some, 24 to 70 and 70 to 200 2.8 lenses. We've been waiting for them. We're thrilled to have them. I do video work. Probably 50% of my work is video. Shooting a film in May, and we're shooting on the A7S II. We're going to have the A6300 on set because that 24p video mode is very clean. It's a very pleasing image. This would be a great B camera. I think it would be. I know there are some people who disagree with me, but I am declaring the Sony A6300 as the overall winner in this Epic Shootout, and this is the camera that I am going to put in my camera bag. Very impressed with it. For a mirrorless camera, it's the first one I've seen outfocus a DSLR in most conditions. Just loaded with video features. I love the size, that it's small. And so for me, this is the tool that I want to have and hang on to. So that is my Epic Shootout. I want to say thank you guys so much for your support. If you like seeing these Epic Shootouts and you want to see more, the best way you can support me is to like, subscribe, and definitely please share it to anywhere, in any post, any forums you think they'd want to see it. That really helps out my channel, and I think a lot of people want to know about these two cameras. Let me know in the comments below what you think about these two cameras and which ones you want to see in the next Epic Shootout. I am Michael the Maven, and I will see you next time. If you found this video helpful, you might be interested in my crash course on the Sony A6300 or the Canon 80D. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to take great images like a pro in no time. You can order them from the following link.